The summer movie season is upon us, and we've gotten two big blockbusters so far. One being the fantastic Dune 2 from Denis Villeneuve, and the other being Furiosa, the prequel to George Miller's 2015 hit Mad Max Fury Road. Anya Taylor-Joy takes up the titular role of Furiosa, previously played by Charlize Theron, and we learn the character's origins, how she rose through the ranks in Immortan Joe's army, and how she decided to defect and rescue his many wives from his evil clutches. And I mean, that's pretty much the film in a nutshell. While the film's performances are its strongest suit, the film's biggest weakness is the fact that it's very much a prequel. And that comes with the fact that the movie's ultimate goal has to be to set up the status quo that we're already familiar with. Now, I'm generally not a fan of prequels at all. I think the act of retroactively telling the less interesting start of the story after you've already explored the more interesting main conflict and climax is counterproductive. Especially after audiences have spent many years with that original story in the first film. But it wasn't supposed to happen this way, with a Fury Road prequel coming out almost 10 years after the initial release. George Miller actually set about filming Fury Road and Furiosa back to back, but he and his production company ended up suing Warner Brothers over Mad Max Fury Road. You see, Warner Brothers had promised a bonus to the production studio if the film came in under budget. Then there was arguments as to whether or not Miller's studio had actually done so. This went on for years and obviously delayed production on Furiosa for a long time. In the meantime, there are other Mad Max projects in the oven, including the terribly underappreciated video game that Miller had very heavy involvement in. Warner Brothers didn't like that Miller's time was being split between multiple projects, so they took creative control over it. I still think the game was awesome, but it's a really weird mix of stuff that's directly related to Fury Road and Furiosa, and stuff that's not, like the drastic change in roles for Immortan Joe's sons, Scrotus and Erectus. In the game, Scrotus is the big, imposing fighter with the nose tubes, whereas in the movie, he's the more slight and the smarter of the two. It's weird, and Furiosa came close to being both a comic book or an animated prequel instead of a live-action film for a while too. But George Miller and Warner Brothers eventually settled their lawsuit, and here we are in 2024 with Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. And was it worth the wait and all the trouble? Sure. It's not a bad film by any stretch. Anya Taylor-Joy is a great action heroine, even if there is a large disconnect between her performance and Theron's, and if her story just isn't all that interesting. Part of what made Furiosa great in Fury Road was the fact that she was a cipher. We knew that she was a badass woman who clearly did some things in her past that she wasn't proud of, and was in no small way trying to atone for those past sins and right her previous wrongs. Theron plays the character with a tragic stoicism that immediately made the character a fan favorite. And honestly, much like with, in my own personal opinion, Anakin Skywalker in the Star Wars prequels, we were better off with the mystery than anything being spelled out for us in long form. It's a weird concept to me to know that a film is more interesting and engaging than a potential prequel, but the filmmaker's still insisting on producing a prequel knowing full well that it'll be less than the original film simply by design. And knowing that a prequel is lesser than the original film, and knowing that it's not strong enough to be the first film and a lead into the bombastic second film, is kind of a red flag that almost always ends up proving true. Furiosa's life from childhood to literally moments before Fury Road begins is only sort of moderately interesting. It's great to be back in George Miller's wasteland and seeing his sensibilities for this world on the big screen once again, but it lacks the strong, compelling narrative or the spectacle that Fury Road had to latch onto. Everything feels smaller, probably purposefully, because it's all leading up to what was the bombastic adventure that was Fury Road. And after waiting for 10 years, that comes off as terribly anticlimactic for the audience. This movie lives in a dichotomy of wanting to deliver more of that Fury Road magic, but having to hold back because Fury Road is the main course, so to speak. There's never that sense of energy or catharsis that Fury Road delivered because Furiosa just simply can't. We get a denouement between Furiosa and the film's main antagonist Dementis, but it comes after a long, drawn-out storyline that kinda sometimes reads more like a Wikipedia biography, checking off the necessary beats along the way, than it does a 3-act story with a strong payoff. And I don't fully blame George Miller. It must have been incredibly difficult to find the mojo to make this movie after all the nonsense that happened since Fury Road and all the time in between films. The dispute with Warner's, which put a huge strain on their creative partnership, their treatment of him in general in regards to the multiple Mad Max projects happening in 2015, a worldwide pandemic which probably didn't directly interfere with the film's production, but still messed up everybody emotionally for a while. What we ended up with is a movie that shows a lot of effort, but lacks a lot of real movement and passion and something to really say. When I said before that the film feels like it's just checking off boxes as it goes, I really kind of mean it. We have multiple dramatic shots of Furiosa shaving her head. We have multiple dramatic shots of Furiosa in the third act that feel like the film could have just cut to black right then and there as some sort of artistic ending that only alluded to the start of Fury Road. But the film literally takes us all the way to Furiosa loading up Joe's wives into the war rig and taking off with them. I just wish that all the money spent on screen and all these solid performances amounted to a greater sum than their individual parts. Like I said, Anya Taylor-Joy is very good. Chris Hemsworth is fun as Dementus, even if he's a bit too charming to be slimy and a little too slimy to be really charming. My good friend and good friend of the show, Super Laser Seth, mentioned to me that there was an interesting route to be taken with Dementus, where he could have been the populist option amongst the warlords in the wasteland. Somebody who really actually commits to the idea of his promises of more food and more freedom if people follow him, instead of Immortan Joe or the Bullet Farmer. Instead, he's just sort of a generic mustache-twirling villain who just wants more power with no real plan for what he would do with it after getting it, and he's also kind of a fucking idiot. There's also a bizarrely undercooked backstory where he carries around a teddy bear that belonged to his dead children. But there's never any sort of vulnerability or intrigue with Dementus, just half-realized ideas behind a fun performance where Chris Hemsworth is trying really hard to play against type and mostly succeeding. It's an odd film, and I hate that I don't love it. I adore George Miller, and I'm a huge Mad Max fan, and I want to encourage everybody to see this movie because we need more people like George Miller creating these types of left of mainstream blockbusters and having and maintaining influence on the genre. We need less homogenized Disney summer movies and more weird, creative stuff like this, even if it's not a complete success. And I hate that people keep referring to the film's budget versus its box office take and the fact that it's underperforming. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when all these online news feeds on social media keep calling the film a failure and influencing audiences into thinking the film is terrible and not worth their time. It's not a bad movie at all. That is just such a bad metric to measure a film against, and it's such a weird and crappy mindset to default to. It's lazy. Plenty of great films have underperformed at the box office and went on to be hugely successful or successful after their initial theater run. And I think this film will probably find its audience at some point. It didn't totally click for me, but movies aren't supposed to be universal crowd pleasers. Goodness knows that the first 3 Mad Max movies are divisive, but no one can deny their influence and how much passion went into making them. But I think the way that movie news is presented anymore is detrimental to the industry as a whole. Social media just being filled with people throwing around taglines and scoops, trying to get clicks and get noticed to become hugely damaging to movies and are working to turn audiences away instead of hyping a film. Obviously, that's not the subject of this video, but social media scoop culture, or whatever you want to call it, is tearing the movie industry down just as much as the studios, because we as the audience are sending terrible mixed messages to studios and distributors, and it's all becoming a vicious cycle. I really think that Furiosa would perform better if everybody would stop harping on the notion that it's underperforming. We start to root for a film to fail at that point, even if it means a wonderful, creative filmmaker like George Miller, who's pretty much obligated to get this movie out, may get less chances or even no chances at all in the future to do something weird and interesting. And Furiosa is an interesting film worth seeing and discussing for all of its successes and shortcomings. And the internet is turning it into a situation where we're dismissing something based on 280 characters in a tweet, creating a narrative where we're encouraged to skip something because it's not making enough money. Who gives a shit? Go and see the movie and share your honest opinions on what you've seen. If you've already seen the film, leave a comment down below and let's talk about it. Are you on the same page as me, or did you happen to love or even hate the film? Let's do what they're telling us not to do and have an actual conversation about a film outside of how much money it's making at the box office. And that'll do it for this side mission here on Space Castle. Thanks so much for taking the time to hang out with me and talk about Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. This is your Captain DT, signing off.